I just hit it right then. I did talk to GoToMeeting software people, and I now know how to do it, and so we're up and running. Okay, uh, Acts chapter 23. Um, okay, it's already jumping ahead on me. Um, okay, last week we left Paul in the hands of the Roman centurion. If you remember, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the Jews were trying to kill him because they thought that he had taken some Gentiles across the Sorig wall. Now, as we talked about last week, this wall right here you see surrounding the actual temple um, part, the religious part, if you will. And it was against the Jewish law, and this is one of the oral laws. This is a man-made law, but it was against the law for any Gentile to cross over this barrier right here. And it was only about 3 feet high, so you could easily cross it. And it's called the Sorig Wall. And he had been attacked by the Jews because they thought that he had taken these four uh, Gentiles across, but they weren't Gentiles; they were Jews that were going in to complete their vow and make sacrifices. Um, so let's see, my clicker's not clicking. There we go. There's another picture of it. Here's the court of the Gentiles, and you can see this kind of a dotted line that they've drawn in here. So no Gentile could cross and go into the temple area itself. And then this is a stone that was actually found in the remains of the temple, and here's what it says: no foreigner may enter within the balustrade around the sanctuary and the enclosure. Whoever is caught, on himself shall he put blame for the death which will ensue. In other words, if you cross this line right here, you're a dead man. Now, since the mob's accusations against Paul seem to involve primarily the Jewish religion, well, actually, that's all that they involved. The tribune, the Roman centurion, decided to take Paul before the main Jewish judicial body, the Sanhedrin, for a hearing, not for a trial, but for a hearing. And so we start in Acts 23:1. And so Paul is looking at the council. He's in there going, look, I've been a Jew my whole life. I've lived a perfectly good conscience before God to this day. And so before I go on to verse 2, I want to point out that this is Paul. This is Paul. This is the guy that was standing at Stephen's stoning. This is the guy that arrested Christians. This is the guy that was on his way to Damascus with letters so that he could arrest more people. And he's saying here, I've lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. And what's unique about this is he's right. He's absolutely right. He had a perfectly good conscience. He did what he thought God wanted him to do right up to his conversion. And the minute he was converted, 3 days later, when he could see, he went just as hard as a new Christian to do perfectly good conscience before God. So even though Paul had possibly even had people killed, Christians killed, he was still, in his opinion, in his mind, he was doing exactly what God wanted him to do. Okay, so then in verse 2 it goes on, and the high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Well, a prisoner was not supposed to speak before being asked by the high priest. So Ananias had him struck in the mouth. Well, this sort of irritated Paul. Not a little bit, but a whole bunch. And so he began his defense by addressing the members of the Sanhedrin. And I'll show you the scripture in a minute. He said, "Men and brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience this day." And that's what he had said previously. And so Ananias had him struck in the mouth. And if you wonder, I've lost my place in my notes. Indignant, Paul lashed out at Ananias and accused him of breaking the Jewish law, which safeguarded the rights of defendants and presumed them innocent until proved guilty. But there was another law that was unwritten. It was part of the oral law. You don't mess with the high priest. You don't talk to the high priest before the high priest says, "Hey, I have a question for you." So Paul hadn't been charged with a crime, but he had talked to the high priest. And so in verse 2-3, Paul said to the high priest, "God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law, order me to be struck?" And then they came back at Paul with something that he didn't know. And he was surprised to hear this. But the bystanders said, "Do you revile God's high priest?" Well, Paul was enough of a Jew to know that you didn't do that. And here's maybe why. This is typically what the high priest would have looked like. Okay? Well, if he had been dressed in these clothes, Paul wouldn't have said anything to him. He certainly wouldn't have chewed him out. But this is more likely how he was dressed. This is the typical garb in Christ's days. And if Bernard was on here, I would say, "No, Bernard, note he's got on sandals." Anyway, little inside joke for those of you who don't know. So he didn't recognize the high priest. And in verse 5, Paul apologizes. And he says, I'm sorry, I was not aware that he was the high priest. For it is written, so it's written in the law, "You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people." But perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, and this is hilarious. This is so Paul. Paul began, he started a fight between them. I just think this is hilarious. Paul began crying out in the council, "Brethren, I'm a Pharisee. I'm a son of a Pharisee." And here's where he starts the fight. "I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead." And if you remember, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, but the Pharisees did. And so basically, Paul is, I don't know if he's toying with them or what. We can't get into Paul's head. We don't know what he's thinking, but I can't help but think, I think I'm going to play around with these guys for a little bit. Well, at this particular time, Paul had very few friends in this body that he was standing in front of. And so he addressed the charges of him, stating that he was a Pharisee and he was on trial for proclaiming the resurrection, but it divided the house. The majority of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees. They were the ones that were in charge of the temple at this particular time. And they didn't believe in the resurrection, as I said a minute ago. Pharisees did. And so they began to violently debate the issue. And things became so intense that the Roman tribune had to remove Paul from the scene, or he was going to get killed. Or at least the tribune thought that. And this hearing had devolved into a big mess, and it yielded no information about the charges against Paul. So it made it possible for Paul to speak out on the most basic doctrine of Christianity, and that's the resurrection of Christ. And the Sadducees didn't believe it, and so they got pretty upset. So here I'm going to go on and show you what the scripture says. As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. It was just a big mess. Everybody yelling at everybody. It was like a basketball game. And the referees have made some calls that neither side likes. And it's just a big mess. Everybody's yelling and screaming. And so verse 9, it says, there occurred a great uproar. And some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, we don't find anything wrong with this guy. Maybe a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces. And he ordered the troops to go down and take him away by force and bring him into the barracks. And here are the barracks. Now, this area right here, these 4 columns right here, this is what's known as the Temple Antonia. And it's where the Roman guard stayed. Now, this is attached to the temple. I'll show you. It's got another picture. Here is the Temple Antonia, where the soldiers stayed. Here is the temple right here. It's called the Antonia Fortress. And over here, the Royal Stoa, by the way, just FYI, is where a lot of the things, when Christ turned the tables over, the money changers, it happened in here. It's my understanding that on the day of Pentecost, they were in here, and so on. But this is a drawing of what the temple would have looked like. And I don't know why that happened. Okay. So in verse 11, it says, but on the night immediately following, okay, so the next night, the Lord stood at his side and said to Paul, don't worry, Paul, you have witnessed correctly about me in Jerusalem, but guess what? You got to go to Rome. And so if you remember, or as we get into this, a few chapters from here, Paul is insistent that he's going to Rome. People try to talk him out of it. Doesn't do any good. Christ told him he was going to Rome. He was going to Rome. So in verse 12, the next day, isn't this interesting? The Jews formed a conspiracy, and they bound themselves under oath, saying they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 of them who made this vow or formed this plot. And
hey, Skip.
Yeah, Blake.
You know, a lot of people get confused why the Jews were so vehemently against, what Paul is doing here. I mean, it's just, one account after the other, right?
Yep.
And I think people forget that God divorced his people, the people of the earth at Babel, and he made a covenant with Abraham, and that he was going to reconcile all through Abraham, right? And that was kind of like their inside. They had the inside handshake with, having that deal with, they were God's chosen people. And so, what Paul represents here is, for them, blasphemy against that. And, they didn't understand that. I guess they didn't want for that to happen. I think that they don't understand that even Paul knew that this is what he was going to be speaking into. It's amazing to me how, people, if you get a little bit of context, a little bit of history behind it, you can see why generation after generation, they've been told that this is only for them, not the Gentile. It's amazing to me how many times they're not going to go. They're not going to budge.
Right. It was the you and me God complex that they were all and many of us have attended churches that thought we were the one church and all of that. All of those things. And if you remember now, go back not too far back, they killed Stephen for the same reason. Stephen was
Mhm.
saying bad things in their opinion about the temple, about Palestine, about they revered the prophets, and Stephen said, "Well, yeah, you killed them all. What do you mean you revere the prophets?" But if you remember now, this whole thing started when they thought he had taken those horrible Gentiles across the sword wall, and then he's adding to it, as you say, he's adding to it as he goes forward.
But
Uh,
not to mention,
yeah,
oh, go ahead. Well, I mean, the power and the prestige that the priests and the high priests and those that they carried, which we hear a lot about how they made their garments wide and their hems wide, and they like to preach from the corners and shout from the corners. What Paul was preaching was the end of all that. What he was preaching was the lowly and that we're all priests. I mean, maybe not those exact words at the time, but that's what Peter wrote. That we're all priests. And the whole next, I mean, the things he was saying, it stripped them of what they had felt like they'd accomplished, their genealogy and all these things. That was that's a big deal to them. I mean, that was a big deal.
that's right.
What do you think? I went back and just said, what do you think Paul's reason was for pitting them against each other? Is he just buying himself time in the situation, you think?
Hey, Skip, what I see happening here is Paul was using a tactic that was a military tactic, and he used this when he claimed he was a Roman citizen. He used the tactic of divide and conquer.
Uh-huh.
And you see that several times throughout his ministry, where things got a little bit in a really tough situation, and then he did something and had them going at each other to, throw them off the course.
Yeah, that makes sense, John. Thanks. Now,
The thing to consider,
yeah,
Skip, is that it's not just that they felt that they were the one true people, the one true church, the only path and the only way. And they have some scriptures they point to that would indicate that, but they do that to the exclusion of the rest of scripture. But the other thing to consider, and one of the main reasons why they took counsel to kill Christ, was because we're dealing with people that were affecting their business, their income, and their power over the people. And when that happens, you will see vitriol like you will have never seen vitriol. And it's a staple of human nature that when anyone threatens a power structure, even if it's corrupt, the deep state will come out in droves and make all kinds of false accusations and do all kinds of insane, crazy things to make sure that their power and their gravy train is not interrupted in any capacity. That's probably why they were so vehement to take counsel to kill Paul, which was kind of the same reason they wanted to kill Christ and why they killed Stephen.
Yep. Okay, good points. I've got a little note here, little Skip's humor about these guys that vowed to not eat until they killed Paul. I guess they all died of malnutrition because they didn't kill him. So they must have never eaten again. These poor guys just died. It was a long fast. If you put it that way.
Throughout the history, you see people making vows that they wish they probably hadn't made.
Yeah. And I'm afraid some of us in our prayers have Father, I'll not do that again if you'll help me out of this mess. Okay, verse 14 said so these guys that vowed that they were going to kill Paul or get Paul killed, they went to the high priest, the chief priests, and the elders and told them what they had done. I guess to influence them to make sure that Paul got charged and so on. So and then the plot thickens. Verse 15. They said to them, now, therefore, you and the council do this. You tell the commander of the guard to bring him down, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation, and we're going to kill him. I mean, really? I just, it says, we're ready for our part and ready to slay him before he comes near the place. But Paul's nephew, and we don't even know that Paul has a nephew, but he does. The son of Paul's sister, which would be a nephew, heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks, and he told Paul. Now, you can kind of read between the lines. This man, this young man, whoever, must have known someone, or he wouldn't have been able to get into the barracks to talk to Paul. So, we don't know, who he is or who he knows or whatever. And so in verse 17, Paul, after he'd been told, he called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the commander. He's got something to tell him. It's pretty important. So the centurion took him and led him to the commander and said, look, Paul told me to come and he told me to lead this young man to you because he has something important to tell you. So the chief captain by now has probably begun to realize that the Jews can't be trusted. He's this guy's already figured out that, these guys just want to kill this man. And I don't really know why. But when he found out, as John said a minute ago, when he found out that Paul was a Roman citizen, he began to realize, hey, we got to treat this guy a little bit better. So he knew that his life was at stake if something happened to Paul, since Paul was a Roman citizen. So he talks to Paul's nephew, and he says, I'm sorry, I'd already skipped to this one. So the commander took his nephew by the hand and took him aside and started talking to him privately. Said, what is it? What news do you have? And Paul's nephew said, the Jews are going to kill him. They want you to bring him down tomorrow to the council, and they're going to act real innocent, that they're going to have a trial or another hearing. And guess what? They're going to kill him. Verse 21, don't listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, and they've bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink till they kill him. Now, they're ready and waiting for the promise from you. So the commander told the young man to go. He didn't want him in the middle of it. And he said, don't tell anybody that you've told me this. And so he called two of the centurions. Now, a centurion commands 100 soldiers, if I understand it right. Century, 100. So he called two men who are in charge of 200 soldiers. Well, there it is. And said, get 200 soldiers ready by, 9 o'clock in the morning? 9 o'clock at night, to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. I mean, they're going to guard Paul, and nothing bad is going to happen to Paul. Now, here is Caesarea. This is where they were going, and this was the palace right here. This is Herod's palace, and a part of the palace was called a praetorium. And I've got a picture of that a little bit later. So in verse 24, this is a satellite image. This is kind of neat. This is what used to be. And it's been filled up by the ocean after all of these years. And you can see right here in the center was the temple. the Hippodrome, I believe, was a theater for contests and things. The harbor, middle harbor, outer harbor, says palace right here. So I guess this is where the palace was. So this is what Caesarea used to look like. And so in verse 24, they weren't going to make Paul walk. So they also provided mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. And John and I were talking about Felix the other day. There's a lot of information on Felix. It's incredible what the Roman Judeans built. Their concrete is often doing better than our new concrete. Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's amazing how, the pyramids and the things that were built, thousands of years ago, and they're in better shape. I saw a picture of a Roman road, and then a picture of I-55 over close to Memphis, side by side, and it's ridiculous how much better the Roman road that's 3,000 years old has stood up, and the road. Those of you who've been through Memphis know exactly what I'm talking about. Diane came across the Mississippi River Bridge in 1972 when we were going to get married, and there was road construction, and we were over there last month, and she said, "Oh my goodness, they're still working on it." That's 1972.
Hey, Skip.
Yeah, John.
When you showed that picture of Caesarea, when we were over in Israel about 5 years ago, we went to Caesarea, and that Hippodrome is about 80% uncovered, and is amazing how well preserved that was.
Wow. It looks like there's, I'm assuming that this stuff here is still there. The theater, and you say the Hippodrome is there.
The Hippodrome is still there. The part where the palace was is just in pieces, but we were at that entrance to the right side of the Hippodrome. It's just amazing how those things last. As you said, 2,000 years, they're still intact for the most part.
Yeah, it's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Okay, all right, they provided.
Can I?
Yes.
Can I say something about the Roman overkill?
Sure.
Don't you think that was a bit of a political one-upmanship? I mean, nearly 300 men and him riding amidst them on an animal. I think that was a bit of political snubbing on the Romans' part against the Jews. I just had to throw that in.
Well, that makes sense, and in addition to that, they sure wanted him to get there safely. So yeah, they had 100 spearmen and 200 soldiers in addition. Yeah, that like you say, that is overkill, Phyllis.
They're saying we're going to make sure he makes it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to show our power. We're going to show those lowly Jews that we are in charge. Robert,
I always
they were bored.
I always thought of, I guess up until tonight, really, I always thought of those guys as villains, that were those 40 men that were waiting on Paul. But now that, just after hearing you talk earlier about when we were talking about Paul's conscience, these guys were probably just as, they were just doing what Paul was doing before, and it took Paul seeing Christ, or at least, having an encounter with Christ. These guys were probably just as clear conscience as Paul was. They felt what they were doing was probably right before God. Now, they were scheming and plotting, and I'm sure that their conscience, and somehow, they would have been hiding and waiting and lying if they weren't doing something they knew wasn't right. But these guys were doing just what Paul was doing to begin with. Yeah,
that's right. Well, doesn't it say in Hebrews too that they were blinded, that God blinded them so that He could have mercy on them?
absolutely.
So they don't know. I mean, they're so vehement and they're so upset, again, because he represents a destruction to their power base, a destruction to their way of life, a destruction to everything that they hold sacred. And they're blind.
Yeah, I've always just thought of them as villains, you know. I mean, for all we know, these are some of our brothers at the end, you know. They just, I don't know. I see them a little different, man. They were guys like us that wanted to serve God, and or you know, even though they were misled and their flesh got the best of them. I've been there, you know what I mean. But you know, they really thought they were doing something to save what they had, which was their relationship with God, you know.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Wes. You know, have you ever met? Is anybody on here? I want everybody to answer me here, if you don't mind. Have you ever met anybody when you asked them where they go to church, they said, "Oh, I go to the wrong church"? You know, no one.
I haven't.
No one's ever said that. We all think we go to the right church. We think our beliefs are right. We think what we do is right, and that is if we're convinced. You know, we're. You know, I believe that what I believe is absolutely right. I think this is what God has led me to believe, as what God has led me to understand. Now, what I had to quit doing, and Michael Deering on here had to quit doing, is I had to quit cramming what I thought everybody ought to know. I had to quit cramming it down their throats. And I had to stop, and I had to realize, oh, wait a minute, God's called them too. And he's not telling all of us exactly the same thing. We're all working within God's plan, but we're, as you all have heard me say many times, we're on the same road with everybody who believes in Jesus Christ and accepts his sacrifice and so on, all of those things. We're all on the same road, but we're at different mile markers. And 1 mile marker is not any better than the other. And then Paul uses the analogy of the body. And he says, you know, the arms don't do the same thing that the legs do. And if the church of God is, if the metaphor is the body, there's different parts that do different things. And it's okay. As Christ said when the disciples came up to him and said, "Hey, those guys over there are casting out demons in your name. Go tell them to shut up." And Christ said, "No, leave them alone."
I don't know if Baptist, Presbyterian, what, but
Yeah, that's Luke chapter 9, verse 49, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Jim, I can barely hear you. I don't know if you stuck your head down in a well or what, but usually.
was that me?
There, you're better. There you go.
I was telling my friend Mike, who's listening, that I said we've got some new folks on the forum, and some of them, like my friend Mike, are, you know, keep Sunday.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you ain't a Christian.
Nope. Does not.
Another thing I've been thinking through this whole thing is that both the Pharisees and the Sadducees had, within what they believed, had good reason to be against Paul, but the Sadducees had to be even more motivated, because Paul teaching that Christ was resurrected from the dead.
Yeah.
That's got to have a bigger impact on a Sadducee than it does on a Pharisee.
They probably looked at it as blasphemy.
I've found a bunch of debates online. They're really neat. There's a guy named Craig. His last name's Craig, something Lane Craig. And if you've ever heard of him, he does a great job of I'm going to use the word defending for just the lack of a better word, but debating the Bible against atheists. Most of them are atheists. And he was saying that was one of the biggest things that the Jews had problem with, was that Christ had resurrected from the dead, because they only believed that there was going to be a resurrection of all of God's people at some point. But the fact, and this guy, I mean, he's a scholar of scholars. I mean, he has a list of degrees, whatever that means, but he's put his time in, and he said that was one of their biggest. I never thought of that until I heard this guy say it. But I mean, I don't know much about history books. I just like to study the Bible. But that was one of their biggest things was that Christ had resurrected. That was their big hang up, because no one would resurrect before the resurrection.
Yeah, and he didn't fit their belief in what the Messiah was going to do. They thought the Messiah was going to come and kick out the Romans and start the kingdom with Israel, and they were going to be world rulers and so on. And it didn't happen that way. Therefore, he could not have been the Messiah. And some of them understood. God threw out the Holy Spirit. He made it available to a whole bunch of people, but not very many people. It's like the parable of the sower. Not very many of them believed. So, okay, let's see. Okay, so we're just now talking about Felix here. Now, Felix was the governor, and he knew the law. He apparently was a Jewish governor. Some of them weren't. And so he wrote this letter to Claudius Lysias. I don't know if is that the emperor of Rome at this point? Claudius? Is that Caesar? I don't know. But anyway, to the most excellent governor, Felix. Oh, I'm sorry. The Roman soldier wrote this letter to Felix, and he said, he basically told him, here's what happened. When this guy was arrested by the Jews and was about to be killed by them, I came up to him with the troops and rescued him, having learned he was a Roman. He had to get that little tidbit in. Nothing wrong with trying to get an attaboy. And I wanted to find out what exactly the charge was that they were accusing him of. So I brought him down to their council, and I found him to be accused over nothing. It was stuff in their law that we don't pay any attention to. But under no accusation did he deserve death or imprisonment under the Roman law. In other words, well, that's it. I didn't find that this man Paul had broken any Roman law. So when I was informed that there would be a plot against him, I sent him to you. That's why these 300 soldiers are on their way up there to bring him to you. I want to make sure he stays safe. And I also instructed his accusers to go up there too and to bring charges against him before you. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And I've got a picture of that here in just a second. I've got a map. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. So they went back. Some of them went back. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when he had read it, he asked where Paul was from. And he learned that he was from Cilicia, or Cilicia, as I've heard it pronounced. I'm not sure which. But here is a map of the trek that Paul made on his way to Caesarea. He's right here in Jerusalem. He's been arrested. And so he gives his defense before the Sanhedrin. And the Roman soldier came and got him. And so then here goes these 300 soldiers. And when they got to Antipatris, or however you pronounce that, he was under, as it says, under heavy Roman guard. He is then sent to Caesarea. So some of the guards came back, and some went on overnight to get up to Caesarea, and where Paul is imprisoned at the Praetorium, and he's going to be tried before Felix and Agrippa. Agrippa was the king of Israel, of king of the Jews, I suppose. And he told Paul, he said, I'll give you a hearing after your accusers get here, and giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's Praetorium. And that's what this is. And I'm not sure, John, you might be able to tell us where this fit. I don't remember seeing, I don't see Praetorium on this map picture. And I don't here either. So I don't know what part of this the Praetorium was, but you can bet he was under pretty heavy guard. So Paul didn't know how long it would be before his accusers would arrive. He had no idea. And he stayed in this prison, which we'll find out next chapter. He stayed in this prison for about 2 years. And not trying to start an argument or anything, but the prison epistles that were written when Paul was in prison, Philemon and Philippians and what was the other one? Was it Ephesus? Ephesians? Yeah, I think so. Anyway, some commentaries say that it was during this 2-year period of time, but most commentaries say it was during his 2-year prison in Rome. I lean toward Rome, but I don't know that you can close this one out. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out. So that's what I got tonight. So anybody got any more comments? Feel free. Wes, you and Priscilla, I guess, are the only two new ones on tonight. I hope you all enjoyed.
I've had a blast, man. I've actually had a blast. I've been enlightened on a couple different things, man.
Good.
Skip, one of the things that really ticked him off weren't the four gentlemen that, the four gentlemen that Paul brought in and finished a purification process and all that. They were Gentiles. And that was another thing that really upset him.
No, they were Jews. They were Jews. Paul had taken a Gentile in the day before, but these guys were Jews, and they had a vow. We don't know exactly what vow it was, but they
I was thinking it was four Gentiles that he had taken through a purification vow.
No,
I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. That's okay. He had taken a Gentile into the temple, or two Gentiles, I think maybe, a couple of days before. And they were watching every move that Paul made because they didn't like him even a little bit. So when he took those four guys into the temple area to sacrifice a turtle dove probably, or pigeons or whatever it was, to end that vow. Well, if you go back into Acts, don't get me to line.
Mine just says we have four men who want to take the vow to purify. It doesn't really tell me. I just assumed.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. That's what this is for.
If it were up to Paul, he wouldn't even been there. They asked him to go do that just as a good showing. With those guys into the temple.
Yeah, Paul had a reputation that he was trying to strike down everything that was sacred to the Jews, including the law, which we don't believe that he that the law was struck down. It's just, well, anyway, long story. He.
I see what that gentleman's comment was. It does say we have brought So somebody was trusting Paul to do this correctly, knowing that he knew what the Jewish law was.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Okay, I got it now.
And so they could say to the Jews, hey, look, Paul is still taking people into the temple to finish up a vow. And so when they saw him take these 4 men across the Sorg wall, it all broke loose. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, I got a better picture of it now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Anybody else? What is William Lane Craig, Blake? Or who?
That was the gentleman that Wesley was referring to.
Oh, okay.
William Lane Craig. That's him. I've just watched a couple debates. I just you know, I mean, I like to see people defend the faith or God to those who disbelieve. And I'm fascinated by all the. I'm fascinated by how many facts and how many things that are really factual. And I just finished a book. Well, I've almost finished a book, and if you've not read it, it's called The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome book. And I've really been in. I don't know. I've kind of been. I've read it before, and just kind of read it again. I forgot I read it. Told my wife, and I said, you know what? I've read this. It's familiar already. But yeah, that William Lane Craig. If you look him up on YouTube or something, guys. I mean, he just it'll just blow you away how much factual information there is in the history of Jesus in history, not just, you know, Jesus, the story version of Jesus, how much facts that people take. You know, there was no doubt that the tomb was empty. You know, I mean, like there's just so many facts that tomb was empty, and you know, there's so many facts that we had guards. I mean, it's really neat to hear this guy talk about the history and the factual information that we have that just strengthens your faith in what you're reading, you know?
He's a great apologist, and philosopher as well.
Yes, he's both.
Do you say those?
Well, and that's what we like. We like to get down to the facts. We don't like to speculate, do we? We like to get down to the facts.
That's right.
Yeah, and it, you know, a lot of what we, you know, most of what we do is faith, but there's so many factual, historical facts that support a resurrection and a living Christ, man. I mean, there just is. And I didn't even know it until I started kind of rereading Lee Strobel and watching some of these, you know, listen to some of these scholars talk. You know, I mean, it's amazing. If you haven't checked it out, his name's William Lane Craig. Great apologist.
You know, there's 3 words, and we've talked about this many times on our studies. 3 words that are maybe the most important words in Bible study, and that is, I don't know. Don't try to answer every question. If you don't know, or if it's not in the scriptures, just say, I don't know. We don't know.
And that's hard for certain folks. I've found, at least for myself, and that's simply due to how I came to where I'm at, having gone through atheism myself, is a lot of my debates and discussions with atheists in the United States have actually been in many ways more productive than arguments that I would get into with religionists, for lack of a better word, that would argue over every nuance of doctrine.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing to think that atheists, in a lot of ways, would have more of an open mind towards looking at different aspects of the faith than people that, you know, believe things that they were taught in Sunday school or Sabbath school, and they won't budge on those things because it's part of their fundamental tradition. And then when you bring facts, when you bring figures, and you bring different, you know, understandings to things you didn't have before, people that are raised in a tradition, they won't budge on them. And atheists, in the meanwhile, they're only motivated usually by facts. And then a good logical analogy or a logical explanation that can give a particular belief or point of view some validity. And those have gone over real well when I've engaged in those.
You know, a lot of times, Michael, when you know, they bring up contradictions or presumed differences in the Gospels, and what they don't realize is it's the testimony of 4 different witnesses, and if they were all the same, you'd know that somebody gave them the same thing to repeat. But it's the testimony of what they saw, and since it's a legal document, I swear before God, this is what I see, or what I saw. And
Right.
This is the stuff about Jesus. And then their testimony gets confirmed by what I think it was in Acts we read, over 1,000 people. Where did we read that last, Skip?
500 or 500 people.
500.
Yes.
Right. Well, what I've discovered that, recently also is that it's kind of fascinating is that atheists that want to argue atheism as a religion, a lot of them, their points about making the point that the Bible's a fraud and can't be trusted, almost all of it, I'd say 92 to 95% of it, is traditions in the church which are not supported by the Bible. And for people, like us, it's easy to, not easy, but it's been a very interesting way to have a discussion when you agree with the fact that a certain particular doctrine that's a tradition is not supported biblically. And then you could bring history and how it was grafted into the faith way back when, and then you have their ear. And then it gets to the point where you sometimes get into those situations where they'll say, well, the Gospels all contradict themselves. And then, as James explained, you could talk, well, these are different accounts from 4 different witnesses that basically are describing a singular event from their perspectives. But again, like I said, I've had a lot more positive discussions actually with atheists online than I've had with people that are, like to argue over religious doctrine.
I agree 100%.
I mean, right? By grace. So,
Wes said something earlier before we started, and he is more right than he knows. We have an advantage here in the United States that just about everybody you run into and talk to, that you can be a witness to about the relationship you have with Jesus Christ. Almost everybody in this country knows who Jesus Christ is, even if they're not a practicing Christian, or at least they've heard of him, because our culture was based on a biblical foundation. When you go to the third world, whether it's Africa or in my case India, you're dealing with having to preach the gospel to people that have never heard the name of Christ. In India, they worship 300 million major official deities that are government sanctioned. 300 million. And they've never heard of Christ, and they've never heard of the beliefs that we hold on to. So that's starting from scratch, because they worship the creation of the Creator. So we have an advantage here in talking to people, even if they're atheists, in providing a witness or sharing our understanding and relationship than you do when God yanks you to the other side of the world, if he ever does that with you, to go preach to people that have never heard the name.
I like to hear how you do that. I just like to hear what do you say to somebody? I wouldn't know what my mouth would probably open, Michael, but I don't know. I wouldn't know what would come out. I just hope the Holy Spirit would give it to me as I'm told. But I wouldn't know how you did that. And I interrupted somebody. I didn't mean to. I told Skip, I'm talkative. I don't mean to be. I'm just passionate about it. I wouldn't know what to say to people. I wouldn't know how. That's a ministry that's so foreign to me. I just, I don't know what you'd say without, I just couldn't imagine.
Yeah, no, that was my first experience, my first trip there. Chitty, who's my translator there, sat me in front of a bunch of Hindus that he pulled from one of these backward villages. They had never seen a white man. And he says, now preach. And I had no idea at that moment. You were talking about, I was already sweating. I think every bodily fluid just about, drained out of me, because I've been sitting in church for over 2 decades. And I had a head full of knowledge, and I could argue with them over nuances of doctrines that we as Christians like to argue about. Sabbath or Sunday, dunked or sprinkled, speaking in tongues and head coverings or not. All of those things that occupy so much of our argumentation here in the United States. And here I'm dealing with people that have no idea what date even, who the Creator is. But I remember, the Apostle Paul, and when he went to Athens. And thankfully that God brought that to my mind, and I had a rudimentary understanding of Hinduism, and it was just simply I'm here to represent a God that that you don't know, and I use an analogy from their religion to kind of bridge that gap so that they at least hear what I had to say. But yeah, it was an eye opener.
It's the Most High. There's other gods, but this one's the Most High.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Okay. Well, this has been a good one. Anybody else have anything else to say? Priscilla and Wes, welcome. Glad you all joined us, and we won't be back until Saturday at 11, and then we won't be back again until next Tuesday night. So you all are more than welcome.
Yeah, last
Well,
skip.
my
Do what?
my Tuesday nights have opened up because I'm not in the Christmas concert. Oh no.
Well, now I'm going to stop recording before I say this. So hang on.